The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows, glinting off the crystal chandeliers and the polished marble floors, highlighting the absurd luxury my family seemed to swim in as if it were the air they breathed. My kids sat at the edge of the grand dining table, small plates before them, untouched by the attention lavished on my relatives. They were waiting for scraps, mere crumbs of acknowledgement, while my brother and his children laughed over imported pastries and freshly squeezed juice, their chatter filling the cavernous room with warmth that never reached us. I could feel the sting of invisibility, a familiar ache curling in my chest as I watched their eager little faces shift between hope and disappointment. The contrast between their eager innocence and the effortless indulgence of my family's favored children tightened the knot of frustration inside me. Every glance, every whispered comment from the other side of the table drove home the same message. We were outsiders here, undeserving, overlooked. I wanted to speak, to shout, to make them see, but I held my tongue, swallowing the bile of humiliation as my children fidgeted beside me, their small hands clutching their forks with nervous anticipation. This wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last, that we had been relegated to the shadows of their lives, invisible participants in a performance where wealth and status dictated worth. As I sat there, powerless yet simmering with quiet fury, I realized this scene, painful as it was, might be the spark I needed. The ache of neglect sharpened my focus, planting the first seeds of a plan that would, one day, turn this imbalance on its head. My kids deserved better than this, and I promised myself silently that the next time they faced such disdain, it would be on our terms, not theirs. The morning continued, laughter and clinking silverware echoing around us, a cruel soundtrack to our overlooked presence. Yet beneath the sting of exclusion, a quiet determination began to take root, knitting itself into the edges of my anger and hope alike. I remember the countless nights I stayed awake, nursing my siblings through illnesses they barely thanked me for, preparing meals for the family while their eyes barely acknowledged my presence. Every holiday, every birthday, every minor success of theirs, I celebrated quietly, hiding my own exhaustion behind forced smiles, absorbing their praise and attention for them while my efforts went unnoticed. I had spent years running errands, covering mistakes that weren't mine, and sacrificing my own dreams to maintain the smooth illusion of their perfect lives. No one ever asked how I was, what I wanted, or if I even had the energy to keep giving. I worked tirelessly behind the scenes, from managing their properties to smoothing over conflicts, ensuring the family's image remained untarnished, all while my own accomplishments were brushed aside as trivial. I remember the promotions I didn't receive, the scholarships that went unnoticed, the nights I cried quietly because my contributions were invisible. Every sacrifice I made seemed to vanish into thin air, replaced by the constant hum of entitlement and expectation. And yet, I stayed, out of love, out of loyalty, out of hope that one day, my presence would matter. But as I watched my children ignored at the breakfast table, I realized that my devotion was taken for granted, a currency that bought nothing but continued neglect. Every long hour, every overlooked effort, every tear shed in silence has shaped me. And now, those years of hidden struggle are fueling something stronger. A burning desire for recognition, for justice, for the world to finally see what I've carried alone. The pain of invisibility has etched itself into my bones, yet it also fortifies me, giving weight to the promise I made silently that morning. No longer will our sacrifices be invisible. No longer will our value be dictated by their whims. The shadow I walk in for so many years now lights the path for what comes next, and I can feel the first stirrings of empowerment rising alongside the echoes of neglect everywhere I looked. The signs of their wealth screamed at me, a constant reminder of the chasm between their world and mine. Sleek black SUVs lined their driveway like glossy trophies, each one more expensive than the house I had worked so hard to maintain. My brother's children arrived in clothes stitched with logos I couldn't even pronounce, their shoes shiny and perfect, while my kids' sneakers were scuffed from playground adventures and hand-me-downs. Weekends meant private yachts or ski resorts, destinations I had only seen in glossy magazines, while our modest outings consisted of city parks and local museums. Experiences that felt insignificant in comparison. Even their hobbies reflected status rather than passion polo matches, or auctions, and charity galas designed more for display than meaning. The dinner table at home was adorned with crystal glasses and imported silverware, the aromas of delicacies from every corner of the world wafting in the air, while I cooked simple meals for my children that smelled like home, but never seemed to compete with the grandeur surrounding us. Every photograph I scrolled past on social media reinforced it further. Glamorous vacations, designer gifts, and smiling faces that never acknowledged the sacrifices I had made for the family. It was exhausting, this constant display of abundance that only magnified our absence from their attention. And each opulent scene was like a needle, piercing the fragile sense of dignity I clung to. Yet, amidst the envy and frustration, I noticed patterns, cracks beneath the glittering surface, moments where pride and extravagance masked insecurity and fragility. I held onto these observations quietly, a mental ledger of imbalance that would serve as a guide for the reckoning I quietly began to plan. For now, though, the contrast stung sharply: my modest, hard-working life versus their curated, ostentatious display of superiority, a daily lesson in what they valued and what they had overlooked in me and my children. It was my niece's birthday, a supposedly joyful occasion that had always been one of those events where I hoped, against hope, that my kids might feel included. From the moment we arrived, I could see it. My children were pushed to the edges, handed scraps of food after everyone else had eaten, their excitement dampened by the obvious favoritism. The balloons, the carefully wrapped presents, the laughter of the cousins. It all felt like a performance in which we were mere spectators. My kids' eyes darted between their plates and the festivities, confusion and hurt written plainly across their faces. Every attempt they made to join in, to speak, or to participate was met with polite dismissal or a half-hearted glance from my relatives, as if our presence were an inconvenient footnote in their celebration. I felt a familiar rage rising, an almost physical tightening in my chest, as I watched my children endure humiliation I had endured countless times myself. The cake was served last to them, and even then, it was unevenly sliced, a blatant reminder that they were not truly part of this family hierarchy. I clenched my fists under the table, swallowing the words I wanted to scream, aware that losing control would only feed their disregard. In that moment, the frustration I had carried for years converged with the present insult, forging a hot, determined clarity. I realized, with a deep, quiet certainty, that this cycle of neglect would no longer continue unchallenged. The party continued around us, music and laughter filling the room, oblivious to the silent promise forming in my mind. This would end, I told myself, not with confrontation today, but with a plan that they would never see coming. And as I helped my children quietly finish their meager portions, the seed of resolve took root, a stark contrast to the frivolous joy that surrounded us, signaling that the narrative of our marginalization was about to change. That night, after the birthday chaos faded and my kids were finally asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, replaying every moment in my mind: the dismissive glances, the scraps of food, the way my children shrank into themselves. The anger was still there, simmering like an ember beneath my ribs, but now it had cooled into something far more potent: clarity. For the first time in years, I began to look at the family not through the lens of obligation, but through the cold, focused eyes of someone who saw every hidden weak point. Their wealth, their status, their carefully crafted image, none of it was as untouchable as they believed. And I realized that I possessed something they had never taken the time to consider: knowledge. Knowledge of their habits, their dependencies on me, and their increasingly fragile financial arrangements disguised under glittering veneers. I opened my notebook and began writing, not in anger, but with precision. Every unpaid favor I had done for them, every document I had managed, every careless confession they had made over the years, when they assumed I was too loyal or too insignificant to remember. My mind moved like a machine, recalling more than I expected. A contract my cousin had asked me to just glance at, the tax paperwork my sister-in-law begged me to organize, the insider family arguments that revealed cracks in their business partnerships. They had confided in me freely because they believed I was harmless, a background character in their grand narrative, and perhaps that was my greatest advantage. That night, after the birthday chaos faded and my kids were finally asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, replaying every moment in my mind, the dismissive glances, the scraps of food, the way my children shrank into themselves. The anger was still there, simmering like an ember beneath my ribs. But now it had cooled into something far more potent, clarity. For the first time in years, I began to look at the family not through the lens of obligation, but through the cold, focused eyes of someone who saw every hidden weak point. Their wealth, their status, their carefully crafted image, none of it was as untouchable as they believed. And I realized that I possessed something they had never taken the time to consider. Knowledge. Knowledge of their habits, their dependencies on me, and their increasingly fragile financial arrangements disguised under glittering veneers. I opened my notebook and began writing, not in anger, but with precision. Every unpaid favor I had done for them, every document I had managed, every careless confession they had made over the years when they assumed I was too loyal or too insignificant to remember. My mind moved like a machine, recalling more than I expected. A contract my cousin had asked me to just glance at, the tax paperwork my sister-in-law begged me to organize, the insider family arguments that revealed cracks in their business partnerships. They had confided in me freely because they believed I was harmless, a background character in their grand narrative. And perhaps that was my greatest advantage. As I sifted through memories and old emails, ideas began to form, subtle, calculated interventions that would expose their negligence without ever requiring me to raise my voice. I didn't want chaos. I wanted balance. If they prided themselves on image, then image would be the first thread to pull. If they relied on reputation to maintain their business ties, then a small but strategic revelation at the right moment could shift their entire foundation. I wasn't planning anything illegal or reckless, just truth, placed exactly where it would hurt the most. Truth they had handed to me themselves. My internal monologue shifted between cold strategy and protective fire. They don't see you. They don't see your kids. They think you're too grateful to push back. Each thought sharpened the next. I imagined the domino effect. A partner learning the truth about mismanaged funds. A sponsor discovering the behind-the-scenes arrogance disguised as charity. A family elder hearing how they treated my children while preaching unity at every holiday gathering. Small moves, quiet moves, nothing more than reality, finally spoken aloud. I wasn't rushing. This wasn't rage anymore, it was architecture. A careful blueprint built from years of being underestimated. I would act slowly, almost invisibly, because subtlety was my strength. I would let them reveal themselves. Let the truth surface naturally with just the slightest nudge from the person they had pushed aside for years. By the time the clock reached midnight, I felt something shift inside, mere calm certainty replacing the years of swallowed pride. I closed the notebook, not with satisfaction, but with resolve. This wasn't about revenge alone. It was about reclaiming dignity, rewriting the dynamic they had trapped me in. And for the first time, I felt the quiet thrill of knowing the ending would not be the one they expected. The first real sign that things were shifting came unexpectedly, almost innocuously, during a routine family gathering. My cousin, ever boastful about a supposed foolproof investment, had been droning on about his portfolio, assuming I was disinterested and incapable of understanding the details. But I had paid attention over the years, memorizing numbers, patterns, and agreements they casually shared, trusting me because they thought I was powerless. That afternoon, I waited until the right moment, then asked a few pointed questions about a clause they had overlooked, subtle enough to seem curious rather than confrontational. Their smug smiles faltered eyes darting between each other, realizing too late that I knew more than they expected. It was a small victory, a minor crack in their carefully maintained facade. But the effect on me was enormous. I felt the first genuine thrill of quiet power, the realization that knowledge alone could tilt the balance. Later, at a charity gala, I discreetly offered insight into a logistical problem the organizers hadn't considered, saving face for a cousin who would have otherwise embarrassed themselves publicly. They smiled and thanked me superficially, unaware that the subtle influence I had exerted was a reminder that I was no longer invisible. Every small triumph, no matter how seemingly insignificant, built momentum. I noticed how my suggestions were now considered, my input sought after in minor matters I had once been ignored entirely. The contrast was undeniable. The powerless observer of my children's exclusion was now a quiet force shaping outcomes, wielding influence under the radar. Each victory, no matter how minor, reinforced the possibility of larger, more consequential moves. At home, my kids noticed a change too. I carried myself differently, calm but resolute, and they could sense the quiet assurance that had replaced years of submissive endurance. They asked questions, eyes bright, and I smiled, letting them see that sometimes strength is measured in patience and knowledge rather than loud confrontation. By the end of the week, I had accumulated a series of minor wins, a cousin reconsidering a careless remark after I subtly highlighted a contractual detail, a sibling deferring to my advice during a planning session, and small acknowledgments in conversations that once would have bypassed me entirely. These moments were not victories in the traditional sense, but they signaled a seismic shift in perception. I was no longer the overlooked figure. I was the one holding information they needed, the one quietly steering outcomes. And for the first time, I began to imagine the scope of what was possible. And though the changes were subtle, each one was a whisper of the storm to come, a prelude to the reckoning I had begun to map in my mind, proving to myself that the powerless could, indeed, become quietly powerful. It started with a seemingly minor event, but in a family so obsessed with image, even the smallest slip could ripple like an earthquake. During a weekend fundraiser, my cousin, who had always flaunted his perfect portfolio, miscalculated a donation figure, promising far more than he could cover. As the discrepancy became apparent, whispered conversations buzzed through the room, and I could see the subtle panic flicker across faces that were usually flawless masks of confidence. The gala's photographer, eager for a scoop, caught his nervous glances on camera, a silent indictment that would inevitably make its way into the family's social circles. I sat quietly nearby, my fingers folded, watching the unraveling spectacle with a calm that belied the years of simmering frustration beneath my skin. It wasn't just a minor embarrassment. It was the first tangible crack in the armor, a hint that their carefully maintained perfection was vulnerable. My relatives scrambled, trying to smooth over the situation with forced smiles and hasty reassurances. But the tension was palpable, the room thick with the knowledge that not everything could be hidden. I could sense the hierarchy shaking, their dominance momentarily unsettled. Even their loyal friends glanced sideways, sensing an inconsistency they had never noticed before. I kept my expressions neutral, hiding the satisfaction that bubbled quietly within me. Later that evening, I replayed the moments in my mind, analyzing every slip, every hesitation, every subtle panic. I realized that this wasn't luck or coincidence. It was a consequence of the cracks I had been studying for years, the weak points they had never considered while assuming my submission. I imagined the whispers, the gossip that would slowly spread, planting seeds of doubt among those who once elevated them unquestioningly. Even small vulnerabilities in a family so image-conscious could create immense tension when handled carefully. As I left the event with my kids, I felt a mix of anticipation and cautious satisfaction. They were still my children, still overlooked, but now the playing field had shifted ever so slightly. I could almost hear the unspoken question hanging in the air. Could their facade survive? The thought teased me, sharp and thrilling, a promise that what I had patiently prepared was beginning to manifest. This minor hiccup was more than embarrassment, it was a signal that the world they so meticulously curated might finally start to crumble under the weight of truth. And I was ready to see how far the unraveling could go. The next family gathering offered the perfect stage. I didn't storm in with accusations or dramatic flair. That would have played right into their expectations of me as the emotional, powerless one. Instead, I arrived calm, measured, allowing my presence to silently remind them that I was no longer invisible. As conversations unfolded around me, I let subtle remarks slip, carefully worded questions and observations that hinted at knowledge they had assumed I lacked. When my cousin boasted about his pristine finances, I mentioned, almost casually, a minor discrepancy in one of the accounts he had entrusted me to review years ago. His laughter faltered mid-sentence, eyes flicking to mine. Realizing I remembered Dan had quietly preserved every detail he had dismissed at dinner, I recounted a story from years prior, the details almost too precise to be coincidence, about how my children had been overlooked at a prior event. I let the memory hang in the air, watching their faces shift from smug amusement to uncomfortable recognition. My uncle attempted to steer the conversation away, but I pressed gently, asking how they expected loyalty and respect if their own family had been ignored repeatedly. The words weren't harsh, but their weight landed heavily, creating tension in a room that had always hummed with effortless privilege. My relatives exchanged quick, uneasy glances, murmuring half-answers and deflections. But I could see the frustration building behind the cracks in their masks. Their arrogance had blinded them to the impact of their actions, and now, under the subtle spotlight of my knowledge, they squirmed. My sister-in-law attempted a joke about being dramatic, but I countered with a neutral, pointed observation about promises unfulfilled and kindness overlooked, leaving her flustered. Even the youngest cousins, usually quiet and complacent, sensed the shift, glancing at me with newfound attention. Every carefully placed word, every question and anecdote worked to chip away at their composure. I could almost hear the internal panic behind forced smiles, the mental calculations they were scrambling to make, and the anger they masked with polite nods. By the end of the evening, they were jittery, unsure, and clearly unsettled, while I remained calm, quietly satisfied. I hadn't shouted, I hadn't demanded anything, yet the balance had shifted. Their humiliation was subtle but undeniable, and the message was clear. I was no longer the powerless observer in their curated lives. I had begun to leverage guilt, knowledge, and the arrogance they relied on against them. And for the first time, I could feel the faint thrill of control settling in. The moment arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its impact reverberated immediately. I had spent months gathering documents, cross-referencing statements, and quietly alerting the right people to discrepancies my family had long assumed would remain hidden. It began with a seemingly minor legal review an old trust fund my cousin had mismanaged, coupled with an overlook clause that I had meticulously saved. When the discovery came to light, it wasn't a shouting match or confrontation in the courtroom. It was the cold, undeniable facts laid bare. Contracts, bank statements, and correspondence I had archived patiently now spoke louder than any protest they could offer. The revelation hit my relatives like a thunderclap. The family, who had always relied on appearances, suddenly found themselves scrambling to maintain the illusion of control. Publicly, they smiled and nodded, but privately, their panic was palpable. Advisors whispered frantic strategies, lawyers recalculated, and my cousin's usual confident demeanor crumbled beneath the weight of the truth. Meanwhile, my children, who had often been treated as invisible, were finally recognized. Their place at the table, their rights, their contributions, everything that had been denied to them now surfaced in irrefutable evidence. I watched as their faces lit up, a mix of relief and vindication shining through years of neglect. It was surreal to see the transformation. The same relatives who had dismissed my children as irrelevant, whose laughter had once felt like a knife against their small, eager hearts, were now forced into humility. The hierarchy that had long dictated power within the family was shifting, subtle at first, but undeniably real. Each conversation, Each phone call, each whispered plan to manage the fallout underscored the fragility of the empire they had assumed untouchable. My role, once peripheral, became central by default. I felt a quiet satisfaction, but didn't celebrate aloud. This wasn't a personal vendetta. It was justice unfolding logically, systematically, with precision. The catalyst didn't just expose errors or mismanagement, it exposed the moral failures behind the family's arrogance. The way they had devalued my children and me for so long. Their control, once absolute, was now fraying, and the balance of power had begun to tilt decisively. As the days passed, whispers of the discovery spread, first through lawyers and accountants, then through social circles that my relatives had relied on for status and validation. Invitations were rescinded, appointments delayed, reputations quietly questioned, and while they scrambled to mitigate the damage, my children experienced something they had never known: acknowledgement, respect, and inclusion. It was as if the scales that had long weighed against us had finally found the leveling point. Sitting quietly in my home, I reflected on the months of planning, the patience required, the emotional restraint I had exercised. The catalyst event wasn't just a victory. It was the tipping point that transformed possibility into reality. My kids, once sidelined, were now seen. The family's control, once untouchable, had begun to unravel in ways that even they couldn't fully anticipate. And in that delicate, powerful shift, I realized that the reckoning I had quietly orchestrated was no longer a distant concept. It was unfolding, inexorable and undeniable. The day of reckoning arrived with a quiet inevitability that made it all the more devastating for them. It began at a family-hosted gala, an event they had long used to flaunt their wealth and social dominance. The invitations had gone out as usual, polished and elegant, a signal to everyone that their world was untouchable. But this time, the invisible strings I had been quietly tugging for months were ready to snap, and the unraveling started almost imperceptibly. A key sponsor, alerted to the financial mismanagement I had documented, publicly questioned one of my cousin's claims mid-toast. Gasps echoed across the grand hall as murmurs of disbelief rippled from table to table. My relatives' smiles, usually rehearsed and flawless, flickered with panic, and I could almost taste the tension crackling in the air. The humiliation escalated quickly. Guests whispered, fingers pointed subtly, and the cameras that were supposed to capture their effortless glamour instead caught stammered explanations and forced laughter. Every carefully cultivated image of success and superiority began to crumble before the eyes of the very social circles they had always relied on for validation. My cousin attempted to recover, waving off concerns with practiced charm, but the foundation had already shifted, and even his confident tone sounded hollow. Sponsors withdrew, alliances wavered, and subtle snickers became audible murmurs that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, I observed from the side, calm and measured, letting the scene play out. I could feel the karmic energy settle, years of neglect, favoritism, and cruelty finally meeting consequences. The same people who had dismissed my children, who had treated us as invisible, were now scrambling in public to salvage pride and reputation. My kids, for once, were not in the shadows. Their eyes sparkled with recognition, saying that the world their parents had once dominated was no longer impermeable. The balance had shifted, and they were finally vindicated. As the night progressed, the collapse deepened. Details I had quietly leaked to the right channels came to light: mismanaged accounts, ignored obligations, and hidden errors previously brushed aside. Each revelation was precise and measured, designed to maximize exposure while leaving me above reproach. Family members tried to spin explanations, but their words faltered under the weight of documented truth. I could almost see the disbelief in their eyes, the dawning horror of realizing they had underestimated the person they had long considered powerless. The contrast was staggering. The once untouchable, meticulously curated image of wealth and control now fractured, while we stood quietly in the periphery, our dignity intact, our patience rewarded. The hall, filled with glittering guests and opulent decorations, felt like a stage set for poetic justice. Every awkward glance, every hesitant apology, Every whispered correction reinforced the shift. I allowed myself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile as I watched the culmination of years of subtle strategy unfold. By the end of the evening, the once dominant family members were visibly shaken. Some retreated from conversations. Others apologized with the discomfort of humiliation pressing down on them. I had orchestrated nothing illegal, nothing spiteful, only revealed what they had exposed themselves to through arrogance and neglect. It was perfect in its poetic justice, a public collapse that mirrored the emotional pain they had inflicted on us for so long. The power reversal was complete. For the first time, they felt the vulnerability they had long imposed on others, and the karmic payoff was undeniable. The true climax arrived not in a confrontation, but in a quiet unveiling that left my relatives reeling. They had spent years believing themselves untouchable, masters of a world built on wealth, status, and carefully curated appearances, convinced that any attempt to challenge them would be futile. But I had held a secret all along, a carefully preserved advantage they never suspected. It wasn't brute force or a loud accusation, it was leverage, legal and undeniable, secured in the very documents they had dismissed and the contracts they had assumed I would never notice. The revelation came at another family gathering, this time more intimate, where their complacency had never felt safer. I began casually, referencing a discussion from years prior, a clause in a trust, a subtle misstep that had been quietly recorded. At first, they laughed politely, assuming it was another one of my anecdotes meant for reflection, harmless and inconsequential. And then I revealed the extent of it. Their control over certain family assets was no longer absolute. A portion of the estate, long thought inaccessible, had been legally redirected, and I held the documentation to prove it. Every paper, every signature, every clause had been meticulously gathered and verified. The room went silent. My uncle's jaw tightened, my cousin's confident smirk faltered, and even the younger family members glanced between us, sensing the gravity of the moment. I laid it out slowly, letting the facts speak. Funds they had assumed untouchable were no longer theirs to command. Legal obligations they had ignored now demanded action, and privileges they had taken for granted were quietly slipping away. Their reactions were instantaneous and visceral. Faces flushed, stammering attempts at explanations fell flat, and the arrogance that had once defined them crumbled under the weight of truth. My revelation was precise, surgical even, leaving no room for denial. The contrast between their former dominance and the shock etched across their features was stark, a dramatic reversal that left the room charged with tension. It wasn't cruelty, it was justice delivered in the purest form, a reminder that the privileges they had wielded so carelessly carried consequences they had ignored. In that moment, my children, who had endured years of invisibility and neglect, finally witnessed the power of patience, strategy, and quiet perseverance. Their eyes reflected a mixture of awe and relief, seeing firsthand that the world that had sidelined them was not untouchable. My quiet smile mirrored their astonishment, knowing that this revelation had shifted the balance irrevocably. By the time the evening drew to a close, the family's dynamics had fundamentally changed. Conversations that had once flowed with unquestioned hierarchy now stuttered with uncertainty. They had assumed their position was immutable, but the twist I revealed proved otherwise. And as I guided my children home, the sense of triumph was tempered by the quiet understanding that justice had been served not with noise or confrontation, but with foresight, patience, and unwavering resolve. The morning after the revelation, the house felt lighter, almost unfamiliar in its calm. My kids and I didn't throw a party or announce our triumph. We simply sat together at the breakfast table, sharing pancakes and laughter that had been stifled for far too long. The sun streamed through the kitchen window, warm and ordinary, a stark contrast to the tension and spectacle of the previous night. It was a quiet celebration, but every smile, every shared story, every small touch carried the weight of vindication. For once, we felt seen, acknowledged, and unburdened by the hierarchy that had once dictated our worth. As we recounted little victories from the previous evening, my children's eyes sparkled with pride and relief. They didn't need grand displays or material rewards to understand that the scales had shifted. The satisfaction came from dignity restored and recognition earned, the kind that no external approval could replicate. I reminded them that patience, strategy, and integrity had brought us here, teaching them that power could be claimed without malice or unnecessary cruelty. Meanwhile, I imagined the family on the other side, reeling quietly from the revelations they had never anticipated. The pride that had once defined them was replaced by uncertainty, subtle fear, and the sting of accountability. They were left to navigate the consequences of their past actions in silence, their dominance fractured but unspoken, a testament to the justice we had achieved without spectacle or vengeance. In those moments, I reflected on the journey, the years of overlooked efforts, the silent sacrifices, and the emotional labor that had prepared us for this quiet triumph. The narrative had shifted, not through confrontation, but through careful orchestration, allowing integrity to assert itself and balance to be restored. My children and I shared a serene sense of empowerment, knowing that while we had not sought to humiliate or destroy, we had reclaimed our rightful place, finally free from the shadows of neglect and favoritism. As I watched my children laugh across the kitchen table, I couldn't help but drift into memories of years long past. I remembered the birthdays we had spent in silence, the holidays where their excitement had been met with indifference, the small gestures of love and effort that had gone unnoticed while my relatives flaunted wealth and status. Each recollection carried a pang of old hurt, a reminder of the invisible weight I had carried alone. Yet, alongside the sting, there was now an undeniable sense of contrast. The powerless figure I once was had transformed into someone capable of influencing outcomes, someone whose patience and careful planning had yielded justice without malice. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed awake, wondering if my sacrifices mattered, fearing that my children would grow up believing they were invisible. And now, seeing them smile, confident and included, I felt a deep, resonant catharsis. The imbalance that had defined our lives had been rectified, not through anger or confrontation, but through foresight, resilience, and strategic action. My mind replayed small victories, each a stepping stone from humiliation to empowerment, from neglect to recognition. In those reflections, I recognized a larger truth. The past could not be rewritten, but it had shaped the tools I used to claim dignity and justice. Every slight, every overlooked achievement, every ignored effort had become fuel for careful orchestration, allowing me to turn years of frustration into calculated action. The contrast between who I had been and who I had become was stark, yet it was not vanity that filled me, but a profound sense of moral satisfaction. We had endured, learned, and finally witnessed balance restored. Sitting quietly with my children after the storm of revelations, I reflected on the lessons this journey had taught us. Family dynamics, I realized, rarely change entirely. People cling to old patterns, to pride, to favoritism, and to the illusions of superiority. Yet, while the past cannot be rewritten, the present can be claimed, and the future shaped with careful choices and unwavering resolve. We had not sought to destroy or humiliate. We had simply reclaimed our dignity, our voice, and the recognition that had long been denied. That alone felt like triumph, a quiet but unshakable victory. I reminded my children that empowerment often comes in subtle forms. True strength is measured not by confrontation or displays of anger, but by patience, foresight, and the courage to act when the moment is right. Karma had its own timing, and by remaining vigilant and steadfast, we had allowed justice to manifest naturally. Observing my relatives adjust to the consequences of their own choices, I felt a sense of satisfaction that was neither bitter nor vengeful, but deeply validating. Our efforts had been acknowledged in the most meaningful way, through the restoration of our place, our worth, and our voice within the family. The lessons extended beyond personal vindication. I realized that life often places us in positions of invisibility or neglect, but these experiences can cultivate resilience, strategic thinking, and emotional intelligence. The hurt and frustration we endure can transform into tools for reclaiming balance and ensuring that fairness prevails, even in subtle, quiet ways. As I watched my children flourish, the laughter echoing through our modest home, I understood that we had won more than recognition. We had won empowerment, the ability to navigate life with confidence and dignity, and the knowledge that justice, even when delayed, could arrive in ways both precise and meaningful. Finally, I allowed myself a deep breath, a sense of closure settling into my chest. The family may continue along their familiar paths, and dynamics may remain imperfect, but we had carved a space of respect, security, and moral satisfaction that no wealth or status could undermine. And in that stillness, I felt the long-term weight of triumph, a quiet assurance that years of patience, sacrifice, and strategic thought had culminated in something lasting, something that would shape our lives for the better, forever.